All right, this is what they wanted. This is the coronation his people spent an entire week begging for, and now that it's here, well, this is where the receipts get real and the whole story falls apart on live camera. Because as of this week, Drake has officially done it. Drake has passed Michael Jackson on the Billboard Hot 100 for the most #1 solo singles by a male artist in the history of that chart, and if you have opened your phone in the last 72 hours, you already know his fan base is treating this like a coronation, like a passing of the crown, like a moment where a boy from Toronto finally walked into the room and took the throne from the king of pop himself. And well, before anybody hands him that crown, before anybody chisels his face into a Mount Rushmore he never earned a ticket to, we have to sit down and have a very honest, very unflinching, very forensic conversation about what this record actually is, what it is not, and why the loudest celebration on the internet right now is being run by, well, the most historically illiterate fan base in modern music history. Now, let me get one thing on the table before the comments try to twist this. This is not a hate piece. Drake has been one of the most commercially dominant artists of this century, and pretending otherwise would be silly. But this video is about the framing. This is about the noise. This is about the gap between a statistic and a legacy, and about the fact that Drake's own camp has spent the last week very deliberately blurring that line to rewrite a story the numbers alone were never going to rewrite for them. Because once you actually scrape the paint off this so-called record, well, what is underneath it is a lot uglier than the fans want to admit. Off camera, while Drake was uploading his celebration graphics, Billboard quietly dropped the full context of this number, and that context matters way more than the headline. Michael Jackson earned 13 #1 solo singles. 13. Every single one of them credited to him, and only him, on the label copy. No feature credit doing the lifting. No detour to Atlanta to borrow somebody else's audience. 13 solo records, in an era when a hit meant physical copies scanned at retail counters, radio spins measured by human ears, and a music video premiere that could freeze the entire country in place. Drake, meanwhile, sits at 14. And of those 14, only 6 are actual solo entries. 6. The rest are features, collaborations, and posse cuts where somebody else was supplying the electricity. That is not an insult. That is the label copy. Read it yourself. So when the Drake fan army posts that screenshot and shouts that he broke the record, what they're actually saying is that a hybrid number was allowed to leapfrog a pure one, and the entire internet is supposed to nod along and pretend the math is the same. It is not the same. It has never been the same. And the moment you say that out loud, the same fan base that spent 5 years calling everybody else a hater will turn around and call you a hater for reading a chart. That is crack #1 in this story. Here is crack #2, and this one is the one his camp really does not want in your timeline. Drake just released 3 albums back to back to back inside a single rollout. A rollout they named Iceman. And the sales report on that project tells a story that undoes every single graphic his people posted this week. Drake sold roughly 13,000 pure copies of one of those albums in a full week. 13,000. A number so small that independent artists on Bandcamp have posted higher on a slow Tuesday. And this is the same Drake his fans call the biggest artist alive. This is the same Drake they claim is carrying the entire game. This is the same Drake whose stans got on the internet and told everybody that Michael Jackson could never do what he is doing right now, while their king is out here moving fewer physical units than a mid-tier vinyl reissue nobody talks about. Now, compare that to the era Michael Jackson operated in. Michael Jackson would move 13,000 units in the time it took him to change a jacket. Michael Jackson sold 20 million copies of Thriller in a single year in America alone. Michael Jackson pushed roughly 105 million copies of that same album worldwide, and the counter is still ticking 4 decades later because his catalog outlives the calendar itself. Michael Jackson did that when a fan had to leave the house, drive to a store, wait in a line, and hand over cash in exchange for the plastic. There was no autoplay. There was no algorithmic playlist. There was no bot farm inflating a stream count in the background. There was a human being standing inside a Tower Records, choosing him. That is the difference between a number and a movement. That is the difference between a chart position and a cultural event. And that is the exact gap the modern Drake fan cannot process, because the modern Drake fan has never lived a day in a world where music had to prove itself on the ground. Which brings us to the part of this story nobody in the Drake camp is willing to say out loud. This record is not the flex. This record is the confession. Because if a full solo era in 2026, with 3 albums stacked into one release window, with playlist real estate on every major streaming platform, with a fan base that treats replaying a song 500 times a day like a religious ritual, only produces 13,000 pure sales, well, that is not dominance. That is dependence. Dependence on the infrastructure that props those numbers up. Dependence on a machine that inflates streams into equivalents. Dependence on a narrative his own fans keep polishing because the raw data will not do the polishing for them. The receipts speak louder than the noise. And the receipts say Drake did not out Michael. Drake outlasted a metric, and then the metric got rewritten around him. Let me put it another way, because this is where most of the arguing online goes off the rails. Nobody is saying Drake is not a hitmaker. Nobody is saying he does not make songs that hit. Drake has been making bops for 15 straight years, and pretending otherwise is silly. The point is that a hitmaker is not the same thing as a giant. A pop star is not the same thing as a monument. And a streaming record is not the same thing as global hysteria. Michael Jackson stopped traffic on 6 continents. Michael Jackson made the black or white premiere so massive that networks in multiple countries interrupted their programming to run it, and the thing pulled roughly 500 million viewers in a single night before the word streaming even existed in a dictionary. Drake, in 2026, with every algorithmic advantage ever invented, still cannot sell out every stadium on a full world tour. That is not a diss. That is public information you can pull up yourself in 3 seconds. And this is where the honesty test starts for everybody watching, because there are 2 very different audiences in the room right now. There is the audience that grew up in the physical era, that remembers what it felt like when a song was so big it echoed through every barbershop, every corner store, every school bus in the country. And then there is the audience that grew up entirely inside the app, that measures greatness by a green up arrow next to a play count. Those 2 audiences are having 2 completely separate conversations, and neither one of them realizes the other is even in the room. The physical era audience is talking about impact. The app era audience is talking about output. And impact and output are not the same currency. Now, let me be fair to the fans defending Drake for a second, because they are not entirely wrong about one thing. Yes, Michael Jackson did not have social media. Yes, Michael Jackson did not have TikTok or Spotify or an Apple Music playlist. And yes, it is honest to say we cannot run a perfectly clean scientific experiment across 2 different eras. Fair enough. But here is the counter the Drake camp keeps ducking. If we're going to say Michael Jackson would have been even bigger with modern tools, then we also have to admit that Drake, without modern tools, would not be Drake. Take away the algorithm. Take away the playlist real estate. Take away the auto cue. Take away the fan armies running loops in their sleep. What is left? A talented Toronto artist with a Degrassi origin story who would still be very good, but who would not be sitting on a chart he only reached because the chart's definition of a hit was quietly rebuilt around the kind of numbers he generates. This is not a hypothetical. This is a mirror. And when Drake's fans refuse to look into it, they end up doing the one thing that hurts his legacy more than any critic ever could. They oversell him. Now, step back and look at what the loudest voices in the Drake camp have actually been posting this week, because this is where it stops being fandom and starts being something else. They are not just celebrating a record. They are trying to bury a legacy. They are lining up on every platform, quote tweeting Billboard headlines, and telling anybody who so much as mentions Michael Jackson to sit down and be quiet. They are calling MJ's era irrelevant. They are calling 40 years of touring, merchandising, philanthropy, choreography, and cultural earthquake a fluke of a slower news cycle. They are treating the king of pop like an outdated benchmark that got timed out by a firmware update. And that is not fandom. That is revisionism. And revisionism is exactly the kind of behavior that turns a fan base into a case study for future documentaries about how the internet lost its mind. The moment the world writes Michael Jackson off is the moment the world tells on itself. Because Michael Jackson is not a chart artifact. Michael Jackson is a load-bearing wall in the entire structure of modern pop music. Every hook Drake ever wrote sits on top of a chord progression that Michael Jackson normalized. Every dance trend Drake ever tried to ride was invented on a stage Michael Jackson built. Every crossover a black artist ever made into the mainstream pop machine walks across a bridge Michael Jackson laid down brick by brick. To dismiss the king of pop because the numbers got easier is to say you do not actually understand what those numbers were paying for. That is exactly why this record does not settle anything. It reframes it. It puts a spotlight on the difference between an artist who moved units and an artist who moved the culture. It puts a spotlight on the difference between a chart record and a chart era. And it puts a spotlight on the deepest and most inconvenient truth in this whole conversation, which is that Drake's problem is not his catalog. Drake's problem is his positioning. He is a pop star operating with a hip-hop identity card, and every single time somebody with a real hip-hop passport walks into the room, the paperwork does not check out. A pop star can break a pop chart record. Of course he can. Nobody is disputing that. The dispute is what happens after the record breaks, because that is when the fan base tries to import the pop achievement into the hip-hop ledger, and hip-hop, well, hip-hop is not a chart. Hip-hop is a covenant. Hip-hop is a set of standards, a set of debts, a set of receipts that go back to block parties, park jams, boroughs, and neighborhoods that were writing themselves onto tape decks decades before streaming existed in a boardroom pitch. And you cannot chart your way into that. You have to earn your way into that. Drake was welcomed in with a visitor's pass, and he has spent the last 2 years walking around like the deed is in his name. It is not. It has never been. And every single time his fans try to hand him one, they make it harder for him to ever get one on merit. That is why the Kendrick Lamar aftermath still hangs over every headline like a permanent weather system. Because when Kendrick decided to test that visitor's pass, the response Drake's camp gave told the whole industry that the boy from Toronto was not built for the covenant. And now, more than a year later, the fans are trying to use a Billboard entry to rewrite a battle they already lost. That is not how this works. You do not unlose a cultural argument with a data point. You do not unlose an identity fight with a marketing graphic. You do not unlose a legacy conversation by yelling louder in a group chat. And here is where the whole thing gets even messier, because Drake himself keeps feeding the fire. Every single time he drops a new project, he goes right back to the same script. He plays the victim. He talks about how everybody is against him. He recites the woe is me monologue over a down-tempo instrumental. He tells his audience that the world is unfair, that the industry is rigged against him, that his critics are haters with no argument. And then he prints another chart record and expects his fans to treat the record like proof of righteousness. It is not proof of anything except distribution. And the more he leans on that framing, the more he confirms that the noise around him is louder than the music inside of him. Which is exactly why the celebration of this MJ record feels so hollow to anybody actually paying attention. It is not the record people are mocking. It is the ceremony. It is the way his stans are treating a hybrid statistic like a holy relic, when the man they are trying to dethrone was pulling 500 million viewers to a single premiere before Drake was old enough to spell his own name. The ceremony does not fit the trophy. The trophy does not fit the god they are comparing him to. And every additional post his fans push out trying to force that comparison ends up shrinking their own artist inside the frame. Now, in fairness, the Drake superfan who actually does understand the difference is out there. There are Drake fans, real Drake fans, who love his music, who buy his merch, who go to his tours, who defend his catalog with actual arguments, and who still know that Michael Jackson is a different weight class of a different sport. Those fans are not the problem. The problem is the loudest layer of the base, the ones who talk more about streams than songs, the ones who measure greatness by playlist inclusions, the ones who think a screenshot ends an argument. Those fans have taken over the conversation, and they are dragging Drake's public image with them into a hole he cannot climb out of on his own. Because at the end of the day, The streaming era is not a legacy machine. It is a distribution machine. It does not make you a giant. It makes you findable. It does not make you an icon. It makes you playable. And the artists who mistake findability for immortality tend to age in exactly the way Drake is starting to age right now. He is not shrinking as an artist. He is shrinking as a symbol. And symbols, in this business, are the only currency that survives the algorithm. Compare that with Michael Jackson one more time, because the comparison is the entire thesis. Michael Jackson sold merch, movies, video specials, tour DVDs, and an entire live spectacle that traveled from Tokyo to Bucharest and packed stadiums that Drake could not fill on his best day with a free ticket giveaway. Michael Jackson had a full-blown Neverland-sized economy attached to his name. Michael Jackson had physical, tangible, human demand. Drake has streams. And streams, in the ledger of history, are the softest currency ever printed. So no, the record does not settle it. No, the numbers do not settle it. And no, 13,000 pure sales on a triple album era do not settle it. What settles it is a very simple question the Drake camp keeps refusing to answer out loud. When the servers go down, when the playlists disappear, when the algorithm resets, and the audience actually has to choose whether to leave the house and buy a ticket, a shirt, or a physical copy, well, who is going to still be on the shelf? Who is going to still be on the wall? Who is going to still be on the merch table? Whose face is going to be on a t-shirt that a teenager in 2055 wears without irony? Because that is the test. That is the only test that has ever mattered in this business. And the second you apply that test to this MJ comparison, well, the record collapses right under its own weight. Now the honest, unpopular, uncomfortable truth is that this conversation is not really about Michael Jackson at all. It is not really about Drake either. It is about what kind of listeners we are becoming. Because if the internet can gaslight itself into believing that a hybrid streaming record erases a physical, cultural, generational giant, well, then we are not listening to music anymore. We are being served content. And once we admit that, everything else in this argument suddenly makes sense. The screenshot wars, the playlist ministry, the stan armies, the chart worship. It is all the same story. It is a listenership that has been trained to measure meaning in numbers, and to measure numbers by whoever is willing to pay for the placement. That is exactly why MJ still wins this. Not because he is untouchable. Not because Drake is untalented. But because Michael Jackson operated in a marketplace where an audience had to choose him with their feet, their wallets, and their time, and he still moved more of them than anybody in modern pop has moved with a full decade of algorithmic tailwind blowing at their back. The moment the world writes him off, the world just tells on itself. And if you are watching this and you're a Drake fan, this is not the part where I tell you to unfollow him or delete Iceman off your phone. Enjoy the music. Enjoy the bops. Enjoy the era. Just do not walk into a legacy conversation carrying a screenshot and act like the argument is over. It is not over. It has not even started. And the more you try to force it, the more you push Drake further from the very ceiling you are trying to help him touch. Because here is the last uncomfortable piece of this whole thing. Michael Jackson, if he were alive right now, would not be arguing on the internet about who broke his record. He would be in a studio, in a rehearsal room, in a costume fitting, in a video shoot, in a stadium walkthrough, in a business meeting, quietly building another era that would erase the debate entirely. That is what giants do. Giants do not defend their records. Giants make the next one impossible to catch. Drake could still be that. Drake still has the runway, the resources, the machine, and the ear of a whole generation to make that pivot. But he is not going to be able to do it while his loudest fans are online telling everybody else to be quiet. He is going to have to grow past them. He is going to have to stop feeding the victim script. He is going to have to stop treating every number as a verdict. And most of all, he is going to have to accept that the record he just broke is not the record that history is going to write about him. History is going to write about the era after this one, and whether he chose to be a chart artist for the rest of his career, or an actual monument that outlives the algorithm. That is the fork in the road. That is the moment he is actually standing at, whether his fans want to admit it or not. And that is why this MJ headline, in the end, is not the trophy his camp is trying to sell you on. It is a mirror. And what Drake sees in that mirror over the next 12 months is going to decide everything about how the next 20 years remember him. Now, I want to hear from you, because this is the part of the conversation the algorithm always tries to skip. Do you think Drake genuinely surpassed Michael Jackson with this chart record, or do you think the record is a technicality his fans oversold to the entire internet? Do you think the streaming era should even be compared to the physical era, or are we watching two totally different sports get scored on the same scoreboard? Do you think Drake still has time to pivot into a real legacy artist, or has the ceiling already been drawn on him for good? Drop your honest take in the comments, because the range of answers on this one is going to be wild, and I read every single one of them. And if this conversation hit something for you, if it clarified something you have been trying to put into words for months, do me a small favor. Tap subscribe, tap the bell, and share this with the friend who has been arguing about MJ and Drake in your group chat for the last 3 days. Because the next video I am dropping goes even deeper into the sales trickery around the Iceman rollout, and once you see that breakdown, the numbers you have been reading online this week are going to start looking very, very different. It is already loaded up right on the screen next to me, and it is the piece that finishes what we started here today. The record broke. The story did not. And the truth, as always, is louder than the trophy.